Hi, I'm Sherri Kane, and I am the Vice President of Medical Veritas International, Inc. It's an online health journal where we offer the medical truth and also educate the public. I am here actually next to Dr. Vernon Neppe, and Dr. Horowitz has urged me to interview you as an expert in the field of psychiatry, metaphysics, mathematics, and water science. And I understand that you have obtained some of your special gifts at birth, and also that you work closely with mathematical genius Edward Close, and together you have published on the discovery of a God particle, which you refer to as Gimmel, and also you have published on the mathematical proof of the existence of God, and how you got into water science and how it relates to elemental hydrogen as well in particular.
All right. Thank you, Sherri. And I appreciate the opportunity to be invited to talk about some esoteric interests that we all have and which are rather important. And here we are in the middle of the Hilton Hotel in Honolulu with some background music and noise, which I think reflects possibly different kinds of vibrational frequencies and relevance in that regard. There's some corrections that I'm going to make here because as a scientist we have to be rather distinct. Just to clarify, people sometimes use a phrase God particle, the Higgs boson was used in that context. I'm not saying it is, but it's interesting that Gimmel could stand for God matrix with the G and the M. And that possibly is far more linked because here is something that exists as a process all the time and impacts everything. The one component that it's not is the God particle, the Higgs boson. It is a very important but very transient phenomenon that was demonstrated in the Large Hadron Collider. And so some of the Swiss so-called Kern or CERN work has been relevant in relation to that. Strangely enough, we developed or discovered an extra component of reality that had to exist besides mass and energy, that had to exist mathematically, which we are calling Gimmel. And a lot of people have jumped onto this and said, hold on, this Gimmel is probably what should be called the God particle, but it's not even really a particle. It is a component, it is a process, it's a third aspect of all of reality. And in the same kind of way, we applied this to a whole string of different elements. The most important element is hydrogen, because hydrogen makes up cosmologically virtually all of existence. And that is because hydrogen, we think, lacks a neutron. And instead of having that neutron, it has extra Gimmel. So it has a compensation of lacking a neutron, and it's full of Gimmel, which we call consciousness. So any substance that has a lot of Gimmel generally is very often, if it's a compound, linked up with hydrogen. So this is where water works in, because water is a very fundamental substance. H2O, hydrogen hydroxide, two hydrogens linked up with an oxygen bonded in a particular kind of way. And if you look at the various compounds that exist in reality, this turns out to have minimally, but importantly, the highest proportion of Gimmel of any substance or any compound. So people can use phrases like water science. I'm not a water scientist. I'm a scientist looking at various physical phenomena and various phenomena pertaining to atoms, one of which just happens to be water. And it turns out that water, like a lot of other elements, is water is a compound, but fitting in there, several different elements are so-called life elements, and they all have certain things in common. And the most amazing thing that they have in common is the figure 108 or 108 cubed.
Wow.
Because when you start calculating this out, you discover that in order to have this third substance, this third volume, you have to have it fitting. Everything has to fit into units. You can't have half an atom or half an electron or half a proton. You have to have a whole. And when you put together electrons plus protons plus neutrons, making up atoms all as wholes, guess what? It is mathematically impossible based on the calculations that we have for the various elements. And this becomes then a refutation of all of materialism. And this is why you were talking about existence of other components pertaining to spirituality. So when one starts talking about these things, it's not just something that we're busy imagining and saying, well, maybe there's an extra component. We know about this extra component. We can't prove it. The problem is we can. And the reason why we can prove things, the only way you can really prove things is through mathematics. But one of the beauties about mathematics is sometimes the mathematics is quite irrelevant. Other times the mathematics is truly relevant, and you can fit together physics and mathematics and you can prove something. So we've been able to prove the existence of this because it had to be. Once we began to understand that everything at the most minimal level has to be an integer, has to be a 1, 2, 3, 4. In other words, a component. It's not half, a quarter. It becomes easy. Once we start understanding that everything has to have volume, in other words, it's not just a point. That means it's three-dimensional. Suddenly, the calculations take a different perspective. Once we understand that there's a mathematics here, a mathematics of cubes, where you have to put together protons, electrons, neutrons, and it cannot work out as atoms until you add in this extra component, this component in addition to mass and energy, Gimmel. Until you understand that, you will not be able to demonstrate anything, despite the fact that in school we were taught about protons, electrons, and neutrons making up the atom, and then later on we were taught about various subatomic particles, even smaller than the protons and the neutrons. But fundamental within it is this third component, Gimmel. We can actually take all the different elements and all the different chemicals for that matter and calculate out how much Gimmel is there in this. Now, the element that has by far the most Gimmel is hydrogen. And the reason why it has so much Gimmel is it is lacking a neutron, hydrogen 1, what we call protein. Very interesting. It means it's just loaded full of something extra instead of that neutron. And that is Gimmel. And when you start putting together this third component, Gimmel, you get amazingly the first figure that you hit in these calculations is 108 or 108 cubed. And we found that every one of the life elements and substances like hydrogen all are multiples of 108 cubed.
Interesting. And now I have a question about the 108. Does that have anything to do with the 9, 1 plus 8 equals 9, as the endless, the end, the infinite, because there's only 1 through 9 in all the numbers, so it's interesting that you mentioned the number 108. Is there any relativity?
Well, of course, 108, 9 times 12 in terms of that, is 108. And when you start subdividing it, actually what is probably more relevant is you'll discover in a number of different religions and philosophies, the number 108 keeps reoccurring. In a lot of Eastern religions, one finds in Judaism 36 times 3, and the number 36 is very important, and 18 times 6, and 18 is very important. So it's not an accident when one starts looking at it.
As a 9.
You start looking at that 9, and of course we then have demonstrated this 9-dimensional reality. So all of those fit in very, very well.
Interesting. So I wanted to ask you another question about 528.
Yeah.
Because again, that actually equals a 6. And what can you tell us in relativity to what you do in your work about 528 hertz frequency, and what is it about it that makes it so interesting to you?
Well, what is interesting there is just the difference in terms of a scale of frequency and any mid-scale of frequency. Unlike you and Dr. Horowitz, I have no expertise in 528, except what I've been taught by you people. But it is interesting that, to me, the most relevant point is the fact that when we're talking frequencies, we're not talking just, we sometimes say, well, this is a wavelength, a length divided by time. In other words, it's space divided by time. I think the key to it all is not just incorporating space and time. In fact, our whole model, you could never just incorporate space and time. You have to incorporate consciousness. So a number like 528, in terms of a frequency, maybe we ought to be developing a new term instead of saying 528 hertz, reflecting just 528 vibrations in a way per second, or trying to measure it in terms of space and time. You have to incorporate things pertaining to consciousness. And this is something that Dr. Close and I are actually working on, because we realize that the biggest single problem we have is terminology. We have to develop new terms because people have not recognized that there are new terms. And when I talk about any kind of frequency, it's the same kind of problem.
Interesting. Now, as far as the water, you're studying water science, and you've learned a lot, you've taught us a lot, and you did a lot of research on the health and the spiritual benefits, how it relates to water. So what can you tell our audience on regards to water and how it relates to their health as a doctor and as a professor, and also how that relates to spirituality through the mathematical discoveries that you've done?
Well, water is one of those compounds that fits that 108 cubed model. In fact, the frequency of water is 10 times that 108 cubed. You're always talking in terms of cubes, so it could be like 10 cubed times 108 cubed. There are other substances that actually correspond exactly. For example, there are certain inert gases like neon that is that same 10 figure in terms of 108 cubed. But when you start looking at other components, you find something very interesting. You find the fundamental elements of life all are divisible, or all are multiples of 108 cubed. Hydrogen, obviously, which is the fundamental one, 1 times 108 cubed, and is loaded full of Gimmel. Water, which actually has the second most Gimmel of any of these substances, but it does. Then you have carbon, oxygen. Now, let me run through this in a different order, and just remember these letters: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, throw in an E, N, nitrogen. spells out chosen. Very interesting. Do you know that all the elements in the special incenses that one finds biblically are components of all of these? They are all components of the life elements.
You're talking about frankincense or myrrh.
Exactly that, exactly that. There are somewhere between 11 and 13 that are particularly mentioned that the high priests had to be completely covered in before they went into the Holy of Holies. If they didn't get completely covered, totally and completely, they had a rope tied to them because they would surely die and they were pulled out of their covenant. You start saying, what's going on? Because there's a strange story biblically and people have never been able to discover it. And atheists, of course, have said, well, this is the reason why the Bible can't even be true. Look at those measurements in terms of this Holy of Holies. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in 3 dimensions of space in a moment in time. It fits in a 9-dimensional model. And my theory is that you had to be covered completely in Gimmel and in the substances that were loaded full of Gimmel in order to be able to enter that, because you were moving from 3S1T to 9 dimensions. Now here's something you've just heard, and you've heard for the first time because I've never publicly verbalized that before. It's a very, very interesting model.
Thank you for sharing that.
There are other elements that are also like this. So for example, calcium and magnesium are also elements of life. Now whenever I talk about this, people say, well, obviously there are other elements of life as well, and the first that they talk about is phosphorus. You know what? Phosphorus is not an element of life. It does not balance, it's not stable and symmetrical in terms of its Gimmel properties. However, it is needed in terms of life because it's an energy packet. And you'll remember we're talking about mass and energy and consciousness as part of what we're calling true units, triadic rotational units of equivalence. And so here, with something like phosphorus, there has to be this load of energy, those energy packets. So it's not bad not being an element of life. You have this whole spectrum that you need in terms of evolution. And if you look at it, you mentioned existence of God. I can't prove the existence of God, but what I can say is it is absolutely astonishing when you start looking at these different figures and you find how close these figures have to be. Close, like Dr. Edward Close, but close in a different sense. They have to be exact. The various scientific discoveries that we've made and their links possibly with the work that you and Dr. Horowitz are performing. Very, very important work, very original and creative, highly important in terms of us being able to understand wholes. And something incidentally that I'm particularly interested in, I have no expertise in the frequency of 528, for example. But what to me is fascinating is the idea of frequencies, but not frequencies that we generally measure in terms of just resonance of space and time. When I like to look upon frequencies and vibrational components, I look upon the third component, and that is consciousness. So whenever we talk about frequencies, we're talking about a frequency of space, time, and consciousness. All a triad, always linked. And if we don't link it, we actually miss the point. And this is what has been happening very, very often. So yes, it's important to have radio frequencies and to have ultraviolet and infrared frequencies all the way through, and that's very, very important. But always within that fabric is the fabric of consciousness. And this is a lot of the research that I and my collaborator of many years, physicist, mathematician, environmental engineer, author of numerous books, who is also involved in terms of various esoteric oils as well, just an awareness of everything at that vibrational level. Dr. Edward Close. And Dr. Edward Close and I have been working very, very closely together to the extent that it's like the one cannot fit without the other. I started off with some research on what we call vortex and dimensionalism, and there were certain things that were lacking, and Dr. Close started off with his transcendental physics, and we couldn't put this all together. And after some years of working together, we found that our model fits, not only perfectly, but fits such that it has grown in intensity and in quality and in great value, we hope, ultimately for mankind. But there's a problem, and the problem is most of mankind is not interested in such esoteric natures. They're not interested that in addition to basic subatomic particles like electrons, protons, neutrons, and the components of protons and neutrons, important components, quarks for example, they're not interested in the fact that actually atomic physics has been lacking something all the way through. Because we know this, we know mathematically that if you put down the number of electrons and protons and neutrons, and we realize each of these are holes, and they are volumes, in other words, three-dimensional, they're not just points, there is no way that you can make an atom unless you have an extra component. And that's the part that I think interests Dr. Horowitz and myself, and that is a component that we call Gimmel, that third component besides mass and energy. Mass, energy, and Gimmel, a content that actually works and has to work very, very effectively. Because without Gimmel, you cannot have a single unit of an atom. And this is what's so fascinating. The whole of atomic materialism would collapse. That the atom consists of a proton, protons, electrons, and neutrons. Generally, the protons and the electrons, their numbers are the same. If you work it out mathematically, realizing that each one of these are units, in other words, you don't have half an electron or half a proton. You have a whole. When you work it out this way, the whole of atomic materialism is refuted. There has to be a third substance, and that third substance is Gimmel. And when we've looked at this further, we've discovered that this third substance, Gimmel, is most likely, under many circumstances, to be nine-dimensional, or linked with a nine-dimensional model, and it has to be sometimes consciousness, or at least in part consciousness. Now this is a dramatic finding. Suddenly we're talking about refutation of atomic materialism. We're talking about nine-dimensional models, not just our length, breadth, and height that we have in this table in a moment in time, so-called 3S1T, 3 dimensions of space in a moment in time. We've got 3 dimensions of space, certainly. That's the volume. Everything is 3-dimensional. But we think, and we cannot fully prove this, but we've got a lot of mathematical data to support it. 3-dimensional time, 3-dimensional consciousness. We know that put together, those are 9 dimensions. And we know that because we are living in this physical reality, people barely are aware of any consciousness. because this comes up as part of the extra dimensions. It was an area that people knew about for many, many years. Kaluza and Klein, quite separately, tried to study a fifth dimension. Now already there, that was exciting, but they were already a little wrong. Because you see, the thing about a fifth dimension is when you look at everything volumetrically, it has to be in three-dimensional clusters. Einstein spent 20 years trying to study extra dimensions, never succeeded. And these people didn't succeed because they didn't introduce consciousness. They didn't realize that extra dimensions had to be in volumes, volumetric. Despite Max Planck, who described the quantum, he did not recognize the quantum as quantized as volume. In other words, everything has to be volumetric. Suddenly, when you start doing this, we're not speculating. We're not just saying, look, it's like string theory. String theory says 10 dimensions, maybe 11. Some string theories are linked up with 26 dimensions. We're not speculating. We can mathematically demonstrate this. And we have mathematically demonstrated it. And we have mathematically demonstrated that certain components of that atom, certain measures, the Cabibbo angle can only be calculated in 9 dimensions. We can demonstrate why the electron is not completely spherical in this regard. We can demonstrate such esoterica as, here's an amazing one. You know about dark matter and dark energy? Dark matter and dark energy, people couldn't figure out, and still cannot figure out where this fits in. We know it forms 95.1% of the cosmos. So only 4.9% is our physical reality. And yet we don't know anything about it. You know that what we've been able to demonstrate, and this is not against speculation. I said to Ed Close, look, if we are within 2% of the calculations in cosmology, it would be amazing because these calculations vary more than 2%. One Sunday, I couldn't hold my excitement. I phoned Ed, I said, I've just done the calculation. You know, it's within 1,000th. Our Gimmel correlation with the whole of what we call it true units, triadic rotational units of equivalent that rotate through 9 dimensions. This link up with dark matter and dark energy at that cosmological level is at the 1 in 1,000 level of correlation. Amazing. And then I said, could it be that it could fit into the atom? Well, this is astonishing. How can 95.1% fit into 4.9%? It cannot in our 3S1T universe, but it can in a 9-dimensional model. And these are the kinds of things we find it, that effectively the same rules apply to quantum physics as to cosmology, as to macrophysics. In other words, there's no longer this quantum weirdness that Richard Feynman, the famous Nobelist who had tried to describe things to ordinary people, would talk about. No quantum weirdness, same thing, same rules, same laws of nature. And when you extend these laws of nature, you discover something amazing. You discover that those laws of nature fit. And they fit also the infinite reality. So now I've differentiated something rather important. I've differentiated this finite reality of 9 dimensions. And what is that? That's all quantized. It's all like little blocks, units. You're not talking half an atom, half an electron, you're talking a whole. Everything quantized as a volume. And this is why we have these kinds of figures. These kinds of quantized figures that we have mean that there is a real law that applies in terms of all of nature. And not only is it finite reality, it's infinite reality. That's not in little blocks, little quanta. It's continuous. The infinite is continuous and it impacts all the time over the finite. And if it impacts continuously all the time over the finite reality, it means that something, people who are spiritual would call this godlike particle, godlike component, will impact all the time. And amazingly, we think this Gimmel derives from the infinite, maybe as photons of light, or certainly linked there, converted through electrons. Einstein described the photoelectric effect. That's what he won his Nobel Prize for. And all of those are very, very linked. The infinite and the finite, the consciousness that is impacting every single thing. This table is impacted by a consciousness. You and me are impacted by consciousness. We have to be. There is nothing in nature that is not. It's just a different kind of consciousness. And all we think ultimately starts at the infinite reality. But there's no end and no beginning in the infinite. So everything continues on forever. Wow, does this mean that we never die? Yes, there's physical death. But life continues with absolute certainty. Oh, well, this is speculation. Others could argue other ways. The data that has accumulated is overwhelming in this regard. But it's also overwhelming in terms of, if you want, a conservation of mass, energy, and consciousness in the infinite that is impacting on the finite. So, of course, some people would argue, this guy does not know anything about physics. Doesn't he know about entropy? Doesn't he know about everything has a tendency towards disorder? Well, I can tell you one thing. I'm not, in my living biological physical state, in a tendency towards disorder. And nor are you, and nor is Dr. Horowitz, and nor is Dr. Close, and nor is anyone else. So, we just say, well, you know, what happens is you guys might be a little bit more ordered, but there's more disorder elsewhere. It doesn't work out. That tendency towards order, what we talk about is called orderly. And orderly is something, again, from the infinite. So you can see how the finite and the infinite interface and interact. And we've already gone on a tour and seen how they're the same laws of nature, cosmologically, quantum-wise, and in terms of our macro reality, that consciousness impacts everything, that we think that third substance is consciousness. And that third substance we have called by the name of Gimmel. And strangely enough, when you start looking at these laws, you say, well, one's got to search for esoteric wisdom. If this is true esoteric wisdom, esoteric knowledge, how come they didn't know about this thousands of years ago? Well, I hate to tell you, they did know about this a long, long time ago. And the way they knew about it was in the various mystical philosophies. Now, I know it's fashionable to talk about Eastern philosophy and to say, well, you know, yeah, this is all relating to these various Vedantic and other Eastern philosophies. The problem is, it is not quite as fashionable, but more accurate to talk about Kabbalic mysticism. Why? Because Eastern philosophies, yeah, there's space and time maybe, and there's consciousness in some kind of way linked up with that space and time. In Kabbalic mysticism, there is the awareness of this whole triad of time, space, and consciousness. There's a link up there whereby there are various words in Hebrew that describe these. The three are separated but indivisible. always linked up as a triad. I'll just mention to you something that startled me. Dr. Close and I have been working together for some 8 or 9 years, very, very seriously. And early on, before we wrote our first book together, Reality Begins with Consciousness, a paradigm shift that works, I was describing this to a Kabbalist. And he said to me, but that's all Kabbalah. And I said to him, how can that be? We spent thousands of hours on it. He was right. I started really looking at Kabbalah and discovered this was so. Now, why is it relevant? It's relevant because if we are dealing with mystical awarenesses and real truths, they should have persisted thousands of years, and they have. And the more I look at our model, and the more I look at Kabbalic mysticism, I find that they are directly linked. In fact, our model is called Triadic, Dimensional, Distinction, Vortical Paradigm. Triadic, that's space-time and consciousness in terms of measurable stuff, all linked. Another kind of triad, mass, energy, and Gimmel, which we think is a content of consciousness. Triadic, dimensional, I've spoken about 9 dimensions of reality. There are other dimensions. You can go higher, and they call that the transfinite. And this was particularly the work of a great mathematician of the late 19th century, early 20th century, George Cantor. Triadic, dimensional, and that dimensional just extends to the infinite, it doesn't end. And then we have distinction, which is an extra component. You see, our model is fascinating. It's fascinating from another point of view. You'll remember that Newton and Leibniz developed calculus. They call it infinitesimal calculus. And basically what it does is it goes further and further and further and smaller and smaller and smaller to infinitesimals until you reach almost an infinity of the infinitesimal. Rather like we've been talking about frequency. You have a frequency vibration. It could be 528, but it could be 1 divided by 528. But you go on and on and on forever with infinitesimal. The problem is this is not how mathematics works, because we mentioned Max Planck, everything being quantized. So this is where distinction comes in. We make distinctions, fundamental distinctions, and one of the fundamental distinctions is the awareness that there are limitations in terms of calculus. There is a limit going by which we cannot go further and further down. There is a limit in terms of size. This is where distinctions fit in. And distinctions also are relevant again in Kabbalic mysticism. And one fundamental distinction that we make in both of these is recognizing that the infinite and the finite are different qualitatively, that we can distinguish them, and yet they are all linked. The boundary is a very, very small boundary, and not any boundary effectively. So triadic dimensional distinction, vortical, these are vortices, spins. You remember in physics, one was taught about half spins and 1/3 of a spin in terms of various particles. And on the one hand, we thought this doesn't make any sense, because how can you have half a spin or 1/3 of a spin? Well, when you have a 9-dimensional reality, everything spins fully, because a half a spin of 180 degrees makes up a whole of 360 degrees. And you go from the first dimension to the 9th dimension, that's 8 half spins or 4 whole rotations. So even there that fits in. And I thought, surely this doesn't fit into Kabbalah. And then I discovered a great Kabbalist named Label Wolf, who wrote about vortices. So this is why we are so inherently linked up with triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm. This is why we are so inherently linked up with something that is very, very relevant for us as well. It's very relevant because each time we hypothesize things, we discover that this is so, because it all fits in to the most beautiful link-up. We discover that, yes, mathematics and physics are unified. Now some might say, well, it's very nice, these guys are busy talking about these esoteric things. It has no relationship to reality. So let me prove to you this has a relationship to reality. This is our latest finding. It's been mentioned but not truly completely published. It's going to be published. It is absolutely blows away the whole idea of what we're talking about. The Large Hadron Collider is the LHC, is the key in terms of physics. You'll remember the Higgs boson, the so-called God particle, discovered this through the Large Hadron Collider. It is very much not a God particle in terms of the fact that it just exists for a fraction of a second. Now, they've been doing all these calculations, and you can work out the exact mass of the electron. How much effectively, in human terms, in gravitational terms, it would weigh on Earth or on the Moon. But mass is a different kind of measure. It's technically measured with inertia. So you can measure the electron and the proton and the neutron, and you can apply figures to it. Now when you normalize these figures and you say, well, let's make the electron 1. We have figures in the 1800s for the proton and for the neutron. And these are all well known, right? Billions of dollars of research with the Large Hadron Collider. When we do our research with Gimmel and with particles, these true units, triadic rotational units of equivalence, rotating through 9 dimensions, including mass and energy volume equivalence, including Gimmel, and we convert it to electrons being 1. Guess what? We have exactly the same figures as for electrons, protons, and neutrons as in the Large Hadron Collider. So nobody can ever say that our work is irrelevant, that our work hasn't been proven. Here you have exact mathematical equivalence, you have exact cosmological and quantized equivalence, you have Gimmel. And this is where I know that you people are particularly